Aloan Voss had always known what she was: broken. Her family had said it so many times. The word had stopped hurting and started feeling like her actual name. But even the broken girl who had spent 19 years hidden in the east wing of Thornhaven understood that what was happening right now was not normal. The Alpha King's wolf was lying in her lap, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. An actual wolf, the size of a warhorse, with silver-black fur and jaws that could crush a man's skull, had crossed the entire great hall in 4 strides, sunk to the stone floor at her feet, and pressed its enormous head into her lap like a dog begging to be petted. Its eyes were closed, its breathing was slow and deep. A low rumble vibrated through its chest, not a growl, but something closer to a purr, if wolves the size of small horses could purr. Eloin sat frozen on the bench near the servants' corridor, her fingers hovering an inch above its skull, afraid to touch it, afraid to breathe, afraid to exist. The great hall had gone completely silent. 40 people stood motionless. Her father, Lord Aldrich Voss, had gone the color of cold ash. Her mother, Lady Sinara, gripped the edge of the banquet table like the floor had tilted beneath her. Her sister Lysara, golden and perfect and everything Aloan was not, stared with her mouth open and her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. 6 royal guards had their hands on their swords, but not one of them moved. Because the wolf was calm, the most dangerous wolf in the known world, the beast that had torn through the Blackmoor uprising and left a battlefield of broken bodies in its wake, was calm, resting, peaceful. In the lap of the daughter, the Voss family had told the entire kingdom was dead. 3 hours earlier, Elowyn had been exactly where she always was, in her room. The east wing of Thornhaven was beautiful, if you didn't think about it too hard. Tall windows, climbing ivy, a writing desk with a view of the orchards. But the door locked from the outside, and the windows didn't open far enough to climb through, and no one came except the maid who brought meals. And occasionally her mother, who always looked at Aloan like she was a stain that wouldn't come out. Today was different, though. Today the entire estate hummed with anxious energy, because King Theron Ashvane was coming. The Alpha King himself, here at Thornhaven, as part of a tour of the noble houses. Eloan had heard the preparations through the walls for days. Silver polished, floors scrubbed. Lysara fitted for 3 different gowns before settling on a deep emerald one that made her look like a painting. "Stay in your room," her mother had told her that morning, her voice carrying the same flat warning it always did. "Do not come out. Do not make a sound. He cannot know you exist." Eloan had nodded because what else was there to do? She had been erased from the family record when she was 7 years old, the year it became undeniable that her wolf would never come. In a world of shifters, where every child's beast emerged between their 5th and 7th year, Eloan's never arrived. No wolf stirred beneath her skin. No golden eyes flickered behind her own. She was hollow where everyone else was whole, and her family had decided that hollowness was a disease best hidden from sight. So she stayed in her room. She read. She watched the orchards change with the seasons. She listened to Lysara's laughter, drifting out from the gardens, and tried not to feel the ache that came with it. But then the kitchen fire happened. A grease flame that leapt from the spit and caught the curtains near the pantry. The staff panicked. Someone propped open the servants' corridor to let the smoke clear, and the draft carried through the east wing and pushed Aloan's unlocked door wide open. Unlocked, because the maid had forgotten in the chaos. Aloan stood in her doorway and stared at the open corridor, like it was a hallucination. She should have stayed. She knew she should have stayed. But the smoke was thickening, and she could hear shouting, and some foolish, desperate part of her thought maybe she could help. She slipped through the servants' passage and followed the noise downward. But she took a wrong turn, where the smoke confused her, where fate simply decided it was done waiting. Because instead of the kitchen she found the great hall, She stepped through a side door and straight into the reception for the Alpha King. The hall was enormous and blazing with candlelight. Nobles lined the long tables, servants moved between them with trays, and at the head of it all, seated beside her father, was King Theron Ashvane. Eloan's breath left her body. He was not what she had expected. The stories described a monster, a warlord with blood on his teeth and madness in his eyes. But the man at the table was young, younger than she had imagined, with dark hair cut short and a jaw that looked carved from granite. His shoulders were impossibly broad beneath the dark formal coat, and his hands, resting on the table, were large and scarred and very still. He was handsome in a way that felt almost aggressive, like his face was daring you to look away. But his eyes were what stopped her, gray, pale and sharp, and filled with something she recognized instantly because she saw it every time she looked in a mirror. Exhaustion. Not the kind that came from a sleepless night, but the bone-deep kind that settled into a person who had been fighting something for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stop. She needed to leave. She needed to turn around and disappear before anyone saw her, but she had hesitated 1 second too long. The king's head snapped toward her. His nostrils flared. His entire body went rigid, and his eyes, those pale gray eyes, locked onto her with an intensity that pinned her to the spot like a blade through cloth. Then the shift happened. It was violent. His body convulsed, the chair shattered beneath him, and the sound that tore from his throat was not human. It was raw and savage and terrible, and the entire hall erupted into screaming chaos. Nobles scrambled backward, guards drew swords, Lysera shrieked, and where the king had been sitting a massive silver-black wolf now stood on the broken remains of the chair, its hackles raised, its lips pulled back over fangs the length of Eloan's fingers. The wolf's gaze swept the room. People froze, and then it moved, not toward the guards, not toward the door, toward her. Eloan couldn't run, her legs refused to obey. The wolf crossed the hall in 4 enormous strides, and she braced for the impact, for teeth, for pain, for the end of her small, hidden, pointless life. The wolf stopped at her feet. It stared up at her, and something shifted in its amber eyes. The aggression bled away. The hackles flattened. The terrible tension in its massive body released like a held breath, and slowly, impossibly, the wolf sank to the floor, pressed its head into her lap, and closed its eyes. Silence crashed over the hall like a wave. Eloan looked up and found her father's face. Lord Aldrich Voss was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not disgust, fear, pure, undiluted terror. Because his dead daughter was sitting in plain sight with the Alpha King's beast in her lap, and every single person in the room had just watched it happen. The wolf slept for 11 minutes. Eloan counted every one of them, because counting was the only thing keeping her from screaming. Its fur was coarser than she had expected, near the shoulders, but impossibly soft behind the ears. And she discovered this because at some point during those 11 minutes, without making any conscious decision to do so, her fingers had begun to move. She stroked the thick ruff of fur along the wolf's neck, and each pass of her hand drew a deeper, slower breath from the enormous animal. Its weight was staggering. Her thighs ached under the pressure of its skull, and her left foot had gone completely numb, but she didn't move. The wolf's beta, a tall man with cropped auburn hair and a scar that cut diagonally across his chin, had positioned himself 6 feet away and was watching her with the focused stillness of someone solving a very difficult problem. He had waved the guards back, silenced the hall with a single raised hand, and now he stood with his arms crossed, his gaze moving between Eloan and the sleeping wolf with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. Eloan met his eyes and mouthed the only thing she could think of. "What do I do?" The beta held up one finger, Wait. So she waited. Around her, the hall had emptied in near silence. Her father and mother had been ushered out by their own household staff, though not before Lady Sonara had shot Eloin a look so venomous it could have curdled milk at 30 paces. Lysara had simply vanished. The servants were gone. Only the royal guards remained, standing at the walls like statues, their eyes never leaving the wolf. And then the wolf stirred. The shift back was quieter than the first. The fur receded. The bones reformed. The mask contracted and reshaped itself until a man knelt on the stone floor where the wolf had been, his forehead resting against Eloin's knee, his hands braced on either side of her legs. King Theron Ashvane was breathing hard. His coat was ruined, split along every seam. His hair was disheveled, and when he lifted his head and looked at her, his gray eyes were clouded with confusion and something that looked very much like shame. "What happened?" he asked. His voice was rough, scraped raw. He didn't seem to know where he was. The beta moved forward immediately. "Sire, you shifted." The king's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands, at the ruined coat. Then he looked at Eloin. "Who are you?" he asked. Before Eloin could answer, the door to the great hall banged open, and Lord Aldrich Voss strode in with the desperate energy of a man trying to contain a fire that had already reached the roof. "Your Majesty," her father said, his voice smooth and practiced, despite the sweat visible on his temples. "I must apologize for this disruption. The girl is a servant, nothing more. She wandered in from the kitchens during the confusion. I will have her removed immediately." Eloin's chest hollowed. A servant, of course, not even worth the truth. The beta's gaze cut to Lord Aldrich with surgical precision. "A servant," he repeated, his tone neutral. "Yes," Aldrich confirmed, reaching for Eloin's arm. The wolf was gone, but the king's eyes flashed bright amber for a single heartbeat, and a growl, low and involuntary, rumbled through his chest. Aldrich's hands stopped 6 inches from Eloin's sleeve. "Don't touch her," Theron said. He sounded surprised by his own words. The hall went very still. Aldrich's face drained of color for the second time that evening. He withdrew his hand, slowly, carefully, the way a man retracts his fingers from the edge of a snapping trap. The beta stepped forward with practiced calm. "Sire, why don't we retire for the evening?" "Lord Voss, the young woman will remain in the guest wing tonight, under royal protection. We will sort this out in the morning." It was not a suggestion. Eloin was escorted to a room in the guest wing by 2 guards who said nothing and closed the door behind her with a click that felt disturbingly familiar. Another locked room, another cage. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The Alpha King had shifted involuntarily, crossed a crowded hall, and fallen asleep in her lap. His wolf, the wolf that had reportedly killed 11 men during the Blackmoor uprising in a single engagement, had purred against her hands like a tame dog, and her father had called her a servant rather than admit she existed. She didn't sleep. At dawn, someone knocked. She opened the door to find the beta standing in the corridor with 2 cups of tea and an expression that suggested he had not slept either. "My name is Joran," he said. "I serve as the king's beta and chief advisor. May I come in?" Eloin stepped aside. Joran entered, set 1 cup of tea on the small table beside the bed, and remained standing. "What is your name?" he asked. "Your real name." "Not whatever Lord Voss is about to tell me." Eloin swallowed hard. "Eloin Voss! I am Lord Aldrich's second daughter." Joran's expression did not change, but the silence that followed told her everything. He already knew her father had lied. "And why, Eloin Voss?" he continued, his voice careful and measured. "Does your family keep you locked in a hidden wing and tell the court you are dead?" The word hit her like a fist. "Dead," she whispered. Joran studied her face, and something in his expression softened by a fraction. "You didn't know," he said quietly. It was not a question. Elowen's throat closed. She shook her head. Hidden, yes. She had always known she was hidden. But dead. They had told people she was dead. Joran set down his tea. The king has requested your presence this afternoon. A meeting in his private study, small. Just advisors. I would like you to attend and sit quietly in the room. Nothing more. Elowen looked at him, bewildered. Why? Because I need to understand what happened last night, Joran said. And I suspect you are the only person who can help me. The king's private study in Thornhaven's guest quarters was a borrowed room lined with someone else's books. It smelled of old leather and dust and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the walls over decades. Elowen sat in a chair near the window, exactly where Joran had placed her, her hands folded tight in her lap. She felt like an object in a display case, something positioned and observed. 4 advisors entered in succession, each glancing at her with varying degrees of curiosity before dismissing her entirely. A servant, a nobody, not worth the effort of a question. Then Theron walked in, and the room changed. It was not something she could explain with logic. The air grew heavier. The walls seemed to contract. Every person in the room straightened slightly, instinctively, responding to a presence that was less a social rank and more a gravitational force. He sat behind the desk without looking at her. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, and Elowen noticed immediately what she had missed the night before. The tremor. His right hand shook, just slightly, a persistent vibration in his fingers that he concealed by pressing them flat against the desk or curling them around a pen. The advisors didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they had learned not to look. The meeting began. Trade disputes along the eastern corridor, a border skirmish that needed a diplomatic response, the redistribution of grain stores after a poor harvest in the southern provinces. Theron listened, asked questions, gave orders. His voice was steady, his mind clearly sharp, but Elowen watched the tremor. It was present when he entered the room. Persistent, visible if you knew where to look. 10 minutes passed. The tremor lessened. Elowen gripped her own hands tighter, watching. 20 minutes, his shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch, the rigid set of his jaw loosened. The tremor in his fingers stilled entirely, and his hand lay flat on the desk, steady and calm. His voice, already low, settled into something deeper and more measured. One of the advisors paused mid-sentence and glanced at the king with a flicker of surprise, as though hearing a version of him that had been absent for some time. 30 minutes. Theron's eyes were clear. His responses were faster, more precise. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked comfortable in his own skin. The meeting ended after 45 minutes. The advisors filed out. Joran lingered by the door, and Theron turned to him. That was productive, the king said, sounding almost surprised. Joran nodded once. It was, Theron frowned. What is it? You have that look. The look that says you know something I don't. Joran opened his mouth, paused, and seemed to decide against whatever he had been about to say. Get some rest, sire. We leave for the capital in 2 days. He stepped out and closed the door behind him. Elowen stood quickly, intending to slip out before the king noticed she was still there. She made it 3 steps. Wait. Elowen froze. She turned slowly. Theron was looking at her from behind the desk, and up close in the daylight, filtering through the study window, she could see the toll. The bruised hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to cast shadows. His skin was drawn tight across his cheekbones in a way that spoke of weeks or months of something eating him from the inside. You were here last night, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. You were the one my wolf went to. He said it flatly, without emotion, like he was confirming the details of a battlefield report. Yes, a muscle jumped in his jaw. I don't remember it. I don't remember any of it. The admission clearly cost him something. She could see it in the way his gaze dropped, the way his hands pressed harder against the desk. It's fine, Elowen said, and then felt immediately foolish because nothing about this situation was fine. Has that happened before? She asked before she could stop herself. The shifting, I mean, without your control. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and guarded. The silence stretched long enough for Elowen to regret every decision that had led to this moment. Forget I asked, she said quickly. That was presumptuous. I am so sorry, Your Majesty. I will just go. She turned toward the door and walked straight into Joran, who had re-entered without a sound. Miss Voss, Joran said, if you would come with me. There is someone I would like you to meet. 1. Joran led her through corridors that smelled of wood polish and candle smoke until they reached a room near the back of the guest quarters that had been converted into a makeshift healing chamber. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling in neat bundles. A portable apothecary case sat open on the table, its glass vials catching the late afternoon light. And behind the table, measuring a pale green powder, with the focus of someone diffusing a weapon, stood a woman with steel-gray hair, cropped close to her skull and hands, that moved with the precision of a surgeon. Brindis, Joran said. This is Elowen Voss. The woman looked up. Her eyes were a startling dark amber, sharp and assessing, and they swept over Elowen with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading bodies for information. It was not an invitation. Elowen sat. Joran withdrew and closed the door. Give me your hand, Brindis instructed. Elowen extended her right hand. Brindis took it, turned it over, pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at her wrist, held it, counted. Then she leaned forward and inhaled deeply near Elowen's wrist, her neck, her hair. You smell like lavender and chalk dust, Brindis said, and something else, something I cannot identify. She released Elowen's hand and sat back. You are wolfless. Yes, Elowen said quietly. The old shame rose in her throat like nausea. Since birth, my family says I am broken. Brindis gave her a look so sharp it could have drawn blood. Your family is wrong about a great many things, including the claim that you are dead, she said, but we will address their stupidity later. Right now, I need you to understand what is happening to the king. Elowen's pulse quickened. The tremor, she said. Brindis paused. Her amber eyes narrowed. You noticed it stopped while I was in the room, Elowen said. During the meeting, it was there when he arrived, and it was gone within 20 minutes. Brindis watched her for a long moment. Then she stood and moved to the window, her back to Elowen. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone choosing every word with precision. The king's wolf is consuming him. In a healthy shifter, the beast and the man exist in balance. 2 halves of the same soul, cooperating, sharing control. In Theron, that balance has been collapsing for over a year. His wolf is growing stronger, more dominant, more difficult to contain. The involuntary shifts are the most visible symptom. But beneath the surface, the wolf is pressing against his mind constantly, eroding his control, eating away at the boundary between man and beast. She turned back to face Elowen. We have tried everything. Sedation, binding rituals, 14 potential mate matches, each hand-picked for compatibility. His wolf rejected every one of them violently. 3 of the women had to be carried out. 1 required stitches. Elowen's blood went cold. But with you, Brindis continued, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked dangerously close to wonder. His wolf did not just tolerate your presence. It submitted, it lay down, it slept. She paused, letting the words settle. That has never happened. Not once. Not with anyone. I don't understand, Elowen whispered. Neither do I, Brindis admitted. You have no wolf. By every measure we use to evaluate shifter compatibility, you should be invisible to his beast. You shouldn't register at all. And yet his wolf crossed a crowded hall and chose you like you were the only person in the room. Elowen's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. What does that mean for him, for the king? Brindis held her gaze. It means that at the current rate of deterioration, King Theron has roughly 3 months before his wolf overtakes him permanently. Once that happens, the man is gone. What remains will be feral, uncontrollable, and unspeakably dangerous. The council will have no choice but to put him down. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples of horror through Eowyn's body. You may be the only thing standing between the king and that outcome, Brindis finished. But there is something else you should know before you decide what to do with that information. She paused, and her expression hardened into something that was not anger, but was very close to it. Your family told the court you died of fever when you were 7 years old. They held a mourning ceremony. They accepted condolences. Lord Aldrich wept publicly. Eowyn's vision blurred. The room tilted, and she gripped the edge of her chair to keep from sliding off it. He wept, she repeated, her voice barely audible. For a daughter he locked in a room and never visited. Brindis watched her, without softening. Not out of cruelty, Eowyn realized, but because this woman understood that false comfort would be worse than the truth. You are not broken, Eowyn Voss, Brindis said. Whatever you are, whatever is inside you that calls to that wolf, it is something your family was too blind and too ashamed to see. She moved to the door and paused with her hand on the latch. The king leaves for the capital in 2 days. Joran will ask you to come with them. I suggest you say yes. Eowyn sat alone in the empty room for a long time after Brindis left. The afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to deep orange across the stone floor. She thought about her father weeping at a mourning ceremony for a daughter who was alive and listening to the world through a locked door. She thought about a king whose own body was turning against him and a wolf that had looked at her like she was the answer to a question no one knew how to ask. And she thought about the word broken, how she had worn it like a brand her entire life, and how for the first time, sitting in this borrowed room, surrounded by someone else's herbs, it felt like a lie. The capital city of Ardenmere rose from the valley like a crown of pale stone and black iron. Eowyn watched it grow larger through the carriage window, her stomach tightening with every mile. She had never left Thornhaven, had never seen a city, had never been surrounded by so many people moving with such purpose and noise, and the sheer volume of it pressed against her senses like a wall of sound she couldn't push through. The royal palace sat at the city's highest point, a fortress of white granite and dark timber that seemed to grow directly from the rock. Guards flanked every gate. Banners bearing the Ashvane crest, a black wolf beneath a shattered moon, snapped in the wind above the towers. Eowyn was escorted through a side entrance, away from the main court, away from curious eyes. Joran walked beside her with the casual authority of a man who could clear a corridor with a glance. Your quarters are adjacent to the king's chambers, he said as they climbed a staircase lined with oil paintings of dead monarchs. There is a connecting door. Eowyn stopped walking. A connecting door, she repeated. Joran continued up the stairs without breaking stride. For proximity. Brindis believes the calming effect is strongest within a range of roughly 15 feet. A separate wing would be too far. Eowyn's face burned. So I am sleeping. Next to the king's bedroom. You are sleeping in a private chamber. That happens to share a wall with the king's private chamber, Joran corrected, his voice infuriatingly neutral. The door will remain closed unless medically necessary. And who decides what is medically necessary? Eowyn asked. Brindis, Joran said. And she has very strong opinions. The room was nicer than anywhere Eowyn had ever slept. A proper bed with actual pillows. A wardrobe stocked with simple but well-made clothes in her size, which meant someone had been planning this. A writing desk near the window with a view of the palace gardens. And on the far wall, a heavy oak door with an iron latch that led, presumably, to the king's chambers. Eowyn stared at that door for a very long time. She unpacked the small bag she had brought from Thornhaven, which contained almost nothing. because she owned almost nothing. 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a book of pressed wildflowers she had been collecting since she was 12, each one labeled in her careful handwriting, with the date and location where she had found it. She placed it on the nightstand and felt a pang of something, homesickness maybe, though how could you miss a prison? That first evening, Brindis arrived to explain the arrangement in clinical detail. Aloan would sleep in her own room with the connecting door cracked open. This would allow her scent and presence to reach the king through the night. If the wolf became agitated, Eloan would be brought into the king's chamber to provide direct proximity. Direct proximity, Eloan said, meaning I sit near him. Meaning you are close enough for his wolf to register you, Brindis clarified. A chair beside the bed will suffice, and if a chair doesn't suffice, then we adapt, Brindis said, and the look she gave Eloan suggested that further questions would not be welcome. That first night, Eloan lay in the dark and listened. Through the cracked door, she could hear him, restless movement. The creak of a bed frame under shifting weight, a low sound, something between a groan and a growl that made the hair on her arms stand up. She pressed her face into the pillow and willed herself to breathe normally. The sounds settled after perhaps an hour. The restless movement slowed, the growling faded, and eventually, silence. She exhaled and closed her eyes. In the morning, she opened her door to find a tray on the floor outside her room. Tea, still warm, toast, with honey, a small jar of blackberry preserves. There was no note. She looked at the connecting door, which was pulled shut from the other side. "Thank you," she said to the door. But the next morning, the tray was there again, and the morning after that. On the fourth morning, the preserves changed from blackberry to plum, and beside the tray sat a book. A botanical guide to the Highland wildflowers of Ardenmuir, leather-bound and beautiful, with hand-painted illustrations on every page. Eloan held it against her chest and felt something crack open behind her ribs. A feeling she couldn't name and wasn't ready to examine. She set the book beside her collection of pressed flowers and tried not to think about the king standing on the other side of that door, choosing a flavor of preserves for a woman he had spoken fewer than 20 words to. A rhythm formed. Mornings. Eloan spent with Brindis in the healing chamber, learning the names of herbs she had never encountered and helping prepare the tinctures the healer used to manage the king's symptoms. Afternoons, she was free to wander the palace gardens, which were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and also deeply overwhelming for someone who had spent 19 years in a single room. Evenings, she returned to her chamber, opened the connecting door a precise 4 inches, and lay in the dark, listening. They did not speak. Not at first. Theron seemed content to pretend the arrangement was purely mechanical, a medical apparatus that happened to involve a person. And Eloan, who had spent her entire life trying not to take up space, was happy to oblige. But silence, she discovered, was harder to maintain than she expected when the person on the other side of the wall was clearly suffering. She could hear it every night. The restlessness, the barely contained growling. The moments of stillness that felt less like sleep and more like a man holding his breath and waiting for something terrible to pass. On the 6th night, she couldn't bear it anymore. "I used to talk to the walls," she said into the darkness. Her voice carried through the cracked door, thin and uncertain. "At Thornhaven? When I was little, I would make up stories and tell them to the stones because there was no one else to listen." Silence from the other room. She almost stopped, almost retreated back into the safe, familiar quiet. But then she heard the restless movement on the other side of the wall go still, and she kept going. My favorite was about a fox who couldn't find her den. Every night she would search, and every night the forest would rearrange itself, so nothing was where she remembered. She would get so frustrated. But she kept searching, because she believed that if she could just remember the right path, everything would make sense again. Nothing. No response. She closed her eyes and felt foolish. But the growling didn't return. And after a while, the silence on the other side of the wall shifted into something that sounded, for the first time, like actual rest. She told a different story the next night, and the next. Small ones. Silly ones. The time she had tried to grow a garden on her windowsill and accidentally cultivated a mold colony so aggressive it ate through the pot. The bird that had built a nest above her window every spring for 6 years, and how she had named each generation of chicks after characters from the only novel she owned. The afternoon, she had discovered that if she pressed her ear to the floor of her room, she could hear music from the ballroom 2 stories below, and how she had taught herself to dance alone in her locked room, to melodies she could barely make out. She didn't know when the silence on the other side of the wall started feeling less like absence and more like attention. But on the 11th night, after she had finished a story about trying to befriend a spider that lived in the corner of her ceiling, a voice came through the cracked door. Did the spider stay? Eloan's heart lurched. What? The spider, Theron said. His voice was rough with something she couldn't identify. You said you named it? Did it stay? She pressed her hand to her mouth. He had been listening, every night, every word. 3 months, she managed. Then it disappeared. I think it found a better corner. A pause. So long, she thought. He had fallen asleep. I doubt that, he said quietly. And Eloan felt warmth flood through her so suddenly, it stole her breath. After that, the conversations grew. Slowly, carefully, like two people learning to walk on ice. He asked questions, never many, but always precise. He remembered details she had mentioned days earlier, and referenced them without fanfare, as though cataloging the fragments of her life was something his mind did automatically. She learned things about him in return, though never because he volunteered them. She learned that he paced when the wolf pressed against his control. She learned the sound his breathing made when the tremors started, a slight catch at the top of each inhale, like his lungs were fighting his own ribs. She learned that he read late into the night, not for pleasure but for exhaustion, trying to tire his mind enough to drown out the wolf. One evening, she arrived to find the connecting door open wider than usual, not 4 inches. Nearly a foot. She paused, staring at the gap. From inside his chamber she heard the scratch of a pen on paper. She sat on her bed, angled toward the open door, and said nothing. The Highland Guide, he said after several minutes still writing. Did you find the section on gentian? Eloan blinked. The blue ones that grow above the tree line? Yes, the illustrations are beautiful. Another pause. More writing. There is a meadow an hour's ride north of the city. They bloom in late summer. You could go if you wanted. Eloan's gaze fixed on the open door. A king was telling a wolfless girl about a meadow full of flowers, and somehow it was the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her. I have never ridden a horse, she admitted. The pen stopped. You have never left Thornhaven, he said. And it was not a question but a realization, and the quiet devastation in his voice nearly undid her. No, she said. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It felt like something settling into place, something that had been waiting. It happened on the 15th night. Eloan was asleep when the sound woke her. Not the usual restless shifting, not the low growl she had grown accustomed to. This was different. A snarl, raw and savage, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. She was on her feet before her mind fully caught up with her body. Through the connecting door, she could see the king's chamber in the dim glow of dying embers. The bedside table was overturned. A water pitcher lay shattered on the stone, and Theron was on his knees in the center of the room, his hands clenched against the floor, his back arched at an angle that looked wrong, looked painful. His body was trying to shift. She could see it happening, the muscles rolling beneath his skin, the bones pressing outward, but it was incomplete, stuck, his body caught between man and wolf. in a way that was clearly agonizing. His breathing was ragged, broken. The sound that tore from his throat was neither human nor animal, but something trapped between the two. Eloan didn't think. She pushed through the door and dropped to her knees beside him. "I am here," she said, reaching for his shoulder. "Theron, I am right here." His skin was burning. The heat of him radiated outward like a fever, and beneath her palm, she could feel the muscles spasming, contracting, fighting. "Don't," he forced out through clenched teeth. "Can't control, I am not leaving," Eloan said, and she wrapped both hands around his forearm and held on. The world dissolved. One moment she was kneeling on cold stone. The next she was somewhere else entirely. A vast landscape stretched before her, colorless and silent. The sky was the gray of old bone. The ground beneath her feet was dark earth, cracked and dry, scattered with stones that gleamed like teeth. And ahead of her, two figures stood facing each other, in the center of what might have been a dead forest. The trees were leafless, white as bleached driftwood, their branches sharp and reaching. One figure was Theron, the man. He stood with his feet planted and his fists clenched, his body rigid with effort, sweat running down his face. His eyes were human, gray and desperate and furious. The other figure was the wolf. But not the animal she had seen in the great hall at Thornhaven. This was something else, something monstrous. The wolf was enormous here, impossibly large, its silver-black fur matted and bristling, its eyes a burning molten amber that held no recognition, no intelligence, only hunger. It circled Theron slowly, patient, relentless, testing. Every few seconds it lunged, and Theron braced against it, pushing it back. But each time he gave ground, inches at first, then feet. The wolf was winning. Eloan understood with sickening clarity what she was seeing. This was not a dream. This was the war happening inside him every moment of every day. The man fighting to hold the line against his own beast, losing ground one painful inch at a time. The wolf lunged again. Theron stumbled. His knee hit the earth, and for a terrible moment, his eyes flickered amber before he wrenched them back to gray. "No!" he snarled, forcing himself upright. "Not yet! Not now!" The wolf growled, low and endless, and the sound vibrated through the ground beneath Eloan's feet. She saw what would happen, saw the trajectory as clearly as a falling stone. The wolf would lunge again, and eventually Theron would not get back up. She moved without thinking. She stepped forward into the space between the man and the beast, directly into the wolf's path, and she looked up at the monstrous thing towering above her. Its amber eyes locked onto hers. The growling stopped. The wolf went still. Completely, unnaturally still, like a predator that had encountered something it didn't understand. Eloan's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The wolf lowered its massive head, its breath washed over her, hot and ancient and wild. It inhaled deeply, drawing in her scent, and then, just as it had in the great hall, the wolf sank down. It pressed its head against her chest and closed its burning amber eyes, and the terrible tension drained from its body like water released from a dam. Behind her, Theron made a sound she had never heard from him. Something broken and raw that might have been a sob. She gasped, awake on the floor of his chamber. Her hands were still gripping his forearm. Theron was slumped against her, his forehead pressed to her shoulder, his breathing ragged but slowing. The shift had receded. His skin was cooling beneath her palms. Human. He was human. They stayed like that for a long time. The embers crackled in the hearth. The shattered water pitcher glittered on the stone. Eventually, his breathing steadied and he pulled back just enough to look at her. His gray eyes were bloodshot and raw, and in them she saw something she recognized. The same expression she had seen in her own reflection every day for 19 years. The look of someone fighting a war they were terrified of losing. You saw it, he said. Not a question. Yes, Elowen whispered. I saw everything. He closed his eyes and turned his face away, and she watched the shame settle over him like a physical weight. Now you understand, he said, his voice barely audible. Now you know what I am. Elowen reached out and turned his face back toward her. Gently, carefully, the way you would handle something precious and wounded. What I know, she said, is that you have been fighting alone, and I know what that feels like. He held her gaze. She held his. You are not doing this alone anymore, she said. His jaw tightened. His eyes gleamed in the firelight, with something that might have been tears. He didn't answer. But he didn't pull away. And when his hand found hers in the dark and held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling, she held on right back. Brindis was waiting for her in the healing chamber the next morning. One look at Elowen's face and the healer, set down her mortar, pulled out a chair and said, "Tell me everything." Elowen told her. The colorless landscape, the dead forest, the war between the man and the wolf. The way the beast had stopped when she stepped between them, how it had pressed its head against her chest and surrendered. Brindis listened without interruption, her amber eyes intent and unblinking. When Elowen finished, the healer was quiet for a long time. You entered his shift space, Brindis said finally. The internal landscape where the man and the beast negotiate control. No one has ever done that. Not a healer, not a bonded mate, not anyone in any record I have ever read. She paused. What you are describing should be impossible. And yet it happened, Elowen said. Yes, Brindis agreed, and it changes everything. She stood and moved to her apothecary case, opening drawers with practiced efficiency. The proximity arrangement is insufficient. A cracked door and a shared wall are not enough. If you can enter his shift space and calm the wolf directly, then what we need is sustained contact, physical closeness, through the night. Elowen's stomach dropped. You want me to sleep in his room? I want you to sleep in his bed, Brindis corrected, without a trace of embarrassment. Ideally with some degree of physical contact maintained throughout the night. The wolf responds to your presence, but based on what you have described, it responds most powerfully to direct touch. Elowen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I cannot just climb into the king's bed, she managed. You can if the king's chief healer prescribes it, Brindis said. Which I am doing right now, Theron resisted. Predictably, furiously, with a cold precision that made it clear he had been anticipating and dreading this conversation. He stood behind his desk with his arms crossed and his jaw set, like a man preparing to defend a fortress. Absolutely not, sire, Joran began. I said no. The healer's recommendation is clear, Joran pressed. And the alternative is your wolf breaking through entirely within weeks instead of months. Then I will manage it. You are not managing it, Joran said, and for the first time since Elowen had known him, there was heat in the beta's voice. You are losing. Every day you lose more ground. I watch it happen. Brindis watches it happen. And now, Elowen has seen it for herself. The battlefield inside your own mind. You are outnumbered, and you are too proud to accept reinforcement. The silence that followed was brutal. Theron's gray eyes cut to Elowen, who stood near the door trying very hard to appear composed, despite the fact that her heart was beating fast enough to power a small mill. You want this? He asked her, and the question carried a weight that went far beyond sleeping arrangements. I want you alive, Elowen said. It came out fiercer than she intended. He watched her. Something moved behind his eyes, fast and unguarded before he shuttered it. Fine, he said. One night we see how it goes. He turned away, and she saw his hand close into a fist at his side. That evening, Elowen stood in the king's chamber and tried to remember how to breathe. The bed was enormous. Dark wood, Dark sheets, wide enough for 4 people, but somehow still dominated by the reality of what was about to happen. Theron emerged from his dressing room in a loose shirt and trousers, and even fully clothed, the sight of him in this context made her pulse stutter. He stopped at the opposite side of the bed and looked at her across the expanse of dark linen. "I sleep on the left," he said. "All right," she replied, and her voice came out approximately 2 octaves higher than normal. They both stood there, neither moved. "This is the most uncomfortable moment of my entire life," Eloin announced. "And I once spent 3 hours pretending to be dead, so a bat would stop circling my room." The corner of his mouth twitched. Just barely, just enough. They climbed into bed from opposite sides with the careful choreography of 2 people determined not to touch. Eloin lay rigid on her back, acutely aware of every inch of space between them. The mattress was absurdly comfortable. The sheet smelled like him, something warm and deep, cedar and smoke, and the wild grass scent of open country. She could hear his breathing, controlled, deliberate. The breathing of a man forcing calm into his body through sheer willpower. Brindis said, "Physical contact." Eloin whispered into the dark. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved. More silence. Then Eloin slid her hand across the sheets, palm up, and left it in the space between them. An offering, not a demand. Seconds passed. Then his fingers found hers. His hand was large and warm and rough with calluses, and when his grip closed around hers, she felt the tremor, the constant maddening vibration in his hand that never fully stopped. She held on, and minute by minute, the tremor quieted. His breathing deepened. The rigid tension in the mattress beside her eased as his body released its iron grip on consciousness. He fell asleep holding her hand, and Eloin lay in the king's bed in the king's palace and felt something vast and terrifying take root inside her. Not fear, something worse. Something far more dangerous than fear. She woke at some point in the deepest part of the night to find that the space between them had vanished. His arm was around her waist, her back was pressed against his chest. His face was tucked against her hair, and each slow exhale warmed the curve of her neck. The tremor was gone, completely, entirely gone. His body was relaxed in a way she had never felt from him, heavy and loose and utterly at peace. Her wolf, the wolf that had never existed. The absence she had carried her entire life like a missing limb, stirred. Not a full awakening, not the explosive emergence every shifter child experienced, but a flutter, a warmth. A presence she had never felt before pressing gently against the inside of her ribs, as if something that had been sleeping far longer than 19 years was beginning, finally, to open its eyes. Eloin's breath caught. She pressed her hand over his where it rested against her stomach and felt his fingers tighten in his sleep. And for the first time in her life, the word broken felt not just like a lie, but like an impossibility. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of sharing his bed, his warmth, his breathing. 3 weeks of watching the tremor retreat, the involuntary shifts grow rarer, the color return to his face. He looked younger when he slept. The hard lines of command softened, and the perpetual tension that lived in his jaw released. And in those quiet dark hours, Eloin let herself look at him without shame. He was beautiful. Not in the way the court probably saw him, all power and danger, but in the way she saw him, tired and brave, and trying so desperately hard to be worthy of a crown he had never wanted. During the days they existed in separate orbit, he ruled, she worked, with Brindis. They passed each other in corridors and exchanged glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. At night, the distance collapsed. They talked in the dark, voices low, sharing pieces of themselves, like smuggled contraband. He told her about the weight of the council's expectations. She told him about the seasons she had tracked from her window how she had memorized the exact day each year the first apple blossom appeared in the orchard, and how one year it came 11 days late and she had been convinced the world was ending. He told her about the first time he shifted, how the wolf had felt like freedom. She told him she had never felt that freedom, and the silence that followed was not pity, but something closer to grief on her behalf. She should have seen it coming. The signs were there, small at first, a headache that wouldn't fade, a heaviness in her limbs that had nothing to do with sleep. Then the nosebleed during a session with Brendis, sudden and startling, blood spotting the dried chamomile she had been sorting. Brendis had looked at the blood on the herbs, then at Eloan. Then she had gone very quiet and reached for Eloan's wrist. "How long?" Brendis asked. "How long have you been feeling the pull?" Eloan didn't pretend not to understand. "Since the first week," she admitted. "It gets stronger every day. When I am close to him, it settles. When I am away, it feels like something is being stretched too thin inside me." Brindis closed her eyes. "A bond," she said, "forming, incomplete but active." She released Aloan's wrist and sat back. "The proximity is feeding it. Every night in his bed, every touch, every shared breath, the bond grows. If it completes, you will be bound to him permanently. If it doesn't, if it's interrupted or severed at this stage, the consequences for both of you could be severe." Eloan didn't tell Theron about the nosebleed, or the headaches, or the strange fluttering warmth that grew stronger every day. She didn't tell him because she knew exactly what he would do, and she was right. Brendis told him. She told him because she was a healer, and because the king's survival was her responsibility, and because she believed he had the right to know that the woman sleeping beside him was being physically altered by his presence. Lowen was in the garden when Joran found her. His expression told her everything before he opened his mouth. "He knows," Joran said. "He is ending the arrangement." The words hit like a closed fist. "No. He has ordered your belongings moved back to the guest chamber. He has also requested that you do not come to his rooms tonight." "He cannot do this," Eloan said, and she could hear her own voice rising, could feel the stretching thing inside her pulling tighter. "He is doing it because the bond is putting you at risk," Joran said carefully. "He believes the proximity is changing you and he won't allow it to continue." "I don't care about the risk." "He does," Joran said. "That is precisely the problem." Theron would not see her. She went to his study and found the door guarded. She went to the council chamber and was turned away. She stood in the corridor outside his rooms that evening and pressed her palm flat against the closed door and felt him on the other side. Felt the bond, stretching between them like a wire pulled to its limit. "Please," she whispered. "Nothing, you stubborn, impossible man," she said, her voice cracking. "You cannot protect me by destroying yourself." She pressed her forehead against the wood and felt the tears come hot and furious and unstoppable. On the other side of the door, something crashed, glass breaking. A snarl, half human and half beast, followed by a silence so profound it made her skin crawl. Then footsteps, moving away from the door, away from her. Aloan stood alone in the corridor and felt the bond between them thinning like a thread being pulled from both ends. Something was breaking. Something essential and irreversible, and she couldn't stop it because he wouldn't let her close enough to try. 5 days without him, and Aloan's body began to fail. The headaches became constant. A pressure behind her eyes that made light feel like a blade. The nosebleeds came twice a day now, sudden and violent, staining her sleeves and her pillow. The warmth in her chest, that had once felt like a promise, now burned like an open wound. Raw and relentless, she couldn't eat. Food turned to ash in her mouth. She slept in fragments, waking every hour, to the phantom sensation of his arm around her waist, reaching for warmth that wasn't there. Brindis watched her decline, with grim, unsurprised efficiency. She checked Aloan's pulse each morning, administered iron tonics, pressed cool compresses to her temples, and said very little. But her jaw grew tighter every day, and on the fourth morning she slammed her mortar against the table hard enough to crack the stone base. "This is killing you both," she said, "and he will not listen." Theron, she learned from Joran, was worse. The tremors had returned within hours of their separation. The involuntary shifts came twice on the second day, 3 times on the third. He had locked himself in his chambers and dismissed his entire staff guards, reported hearing the wolf inside pacing, snarling, throwing itself against the walls. On the fourth night he shifted and did not shift back for 9 hours. 9 hours, Joran repeated, his voice stripped of its usual composure. The longest episode he has ever had. When he came back, he didn't know where he was. He didn't recognize me. Eloan pressed her hand over her mouth. "We are running out of time," Joran said. "Both of you." On the 5th day, Eloan forced herself out of bed, dressed with hands that would not stop shaking, and walked to the council chamber where Theron was scheduled to appear for a meeting he had been avoiding for days. She would not be turned away again. She would not stand outside a closed door and beg. If he wanted to send her away, he could do it to her face. She was halfway down the corridor when the world tilted. The floor rushed upward, and she caught herself against the wall, her vision going white at the edges. She could hear her own heartbeat. Too fast, too thin, a fluttering, desperate rhythm. She pushed off the wall and kept walking. The council chamber door was open. She could see figures inside. Advisors gathered around the long table, and at the head of it, Theron. He looked terrible. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened into bruises. His skin was pale, drawn tight over the bones of his face. His hands were pressed flat against the table, and even from the doorway, she could see the tremor. No longer subtle, but visible. Constant, shaking the papers beneath his fingers. He was holding on by his fingertips, and everyone in the room knew it. Eloan stepped inside. "Your Majesty," his head snapped up. The moment his eyes found her, she saw it. The relief. The relief. Involuntary and enormous, and devastating in its transparency. For one unguarded second, his entire face opened, and she saw exactly how much her absence had cost him. Then, the walls slammed back into place. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough. "I know," she replied. She took another step, her vision blurred. The white edges crept inward. "Eloan," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a wound being torn open. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. Her hand missed. The floor came up fast, and the last thing she heard was the scrape of a chair thrown backward, and his voice, raw and breaking, shouting her name before strong arms caught her and the world went dark. She surfaced slowly. Sounds first, the crackle of a fire, low voices, the clink of glass, then sensation, softness beneath her, warmth around her, and a hand gripping hers so tightly it bordered on painful. She opened her eyes. Theron was beside her, sitting on the floor next to the infirmary cot. Her hand pressed between both of his. He was still trembling. His eyes were red. He looked like a man who had been told the world was ending and had decided to fight it with his bare hands anyway. "You're awake," he said, and his voice fractured on the second word. "Yes," she whispered. "You caught me." "Of course I caught you." He said it like the alternative was unthinkable. Like the idea of her falling without his arms beneath her was a violation of some fundamental law. Brindis stood behind him with her arms crossed. Joran leaned against the far wall. Neither of them spoke, but their silence was deliberate. The silence of people who had arranged this moment and intended to let it play out. "You need to let me stay," Eloan said. "The separation is killing us both. You know this. If the bond completes and something happens to me, it will destroy you," Theron said, and each word sounded like it was being pulled from him by force. "You will die, Eloan. The bond works both ways. If my wolf takes me, you go down with me." "Then don't let the wolf take you," she said. He made a sound, raw and anguished. "You don't understand. Then help me understand, Aloan said. She squeezed his hand. Tell me. Tell me what started this. Tell me why the wolf is winning. The room went still. Theron looked down at their joined hands. She could feel the war inside him through the bond, the fierce, desperate resistance crumbling under the weight of 5 days without her. My brother, he said. The words dropped into the silence like stones. Seal. He was 3 years younger than me. He was everything. I wasn't. Warm, open, easy with people. Everyone loved him. I loved him. He stopped, swallowed. When I took the throne, there was opposition. A faction of the court believed Seal would be a better king, more diplomatic, less volatile. His jaw tightened. They convinced him to issue a formal challenge. The old right. Wolf against wolf. He didn't want to do it. I could see it in his eyes when he stood before the court and spoke the words. But by then, it was too late. The right was invoked. It couldn't be withdrawn. She could feel it through the bond, the black tide of grief, rising inside him. I held back, Theron continued, his voice barely a whisper. During the fight, I held back. I was faster, stronger. I knew I could end it without killing him. I was going to pin him. Force a yield. But the wolf. He closed his eyes. The wolf didn't hold back. It surged, took over completely. And when I came back to myself, Cale was on the ground, and there was blood everywhere. And he was looking at me with this expression. His voice broke. He didn't understand how I could have done it. Like he still trusted me. Even then, even at the end. The silence was unbearable. Eloan felt tears running down her face. Through the bond, she could feel the shape of his guilt, vast and jagged, a wound that had been bleeding for over a year without closing. The wolf broke something that night, Theron said. Not in Kyle. In itself. In me. It killed its own pack, its own blood, and it has been tearing me apart ever since. Every day the wolf pushes harder, and every day I wonder if it's punishing me, or if I simply deserve to be consumed by the thing that killed my brother. Brindis moved forward. The imbalance makes sense now, she said, her voice gentle but clinical. The shifter bond between man and beast is built on trust. The wolf acted against the man's will and took a life the man would have spared. Both halves have been at war ever since, each blaming the other, neither able to forgive. She looked at Eloin. And you are the only thing that quiets both sides, because somehow, impossibly, both the man and the wolf trust you. Theron pressed his forehead to their joined hands. His shoulders shook. Eloin freed one hand and placed it against the back of his head, cradling him. I am not leaving, she said, her voice thick. I don't care what the bond costs me. I am not going anywhere. He didn't argue. He didn't have the strength to argue. He just held on. That night, Eloin returned to his chambers, not to the narrow space on the far side of the bed, not with a cracked door between them. She walked through the connecting door, crossed the room, and sat on the edge of the bed beside him, where he sat with his head bowed and his hands hanging between his knees. You should know what you are choosing, he said without looking up. I know exactly what I am choosing, she replied. You are choosing a man whose own body might betray him, a king whose wolf killed his brother, a bond that could pull you into the dark with me if I fall. Eloin reached out and tilted his face up. His gray eyes found hers, and the naked vulnerability in them made her stomach clench with a ferocity that stole her breath. You are choosing those things too, she said softly. A wolfless woman, a foundling your court will despise, a girl whose own family told the world she was dead because they couldn't bear to look at her. Don't, he said, his voice rough. Don't compare yourself to me. You are not broken, neither are you, she said. He shook his head. You don't know that. I do, Eloin said, because I have been inside your war. I have stood between you and your wolf. And what I saw wasn't a monster. it was two halves of the same wounded heart trying to tear each other apart because neither one knows how to grieve alone. His breath caught. His eyes glistened in the firelight. I have never been afraid of your wolf, Theron. Not once. Not even the first time it crossed a room full of people and put its head in my lap. She leaned closer. Your wolf wasn't trying to hurt me. It was looking for the same thing you are. The same thing I have been looking for my entire life. Someone who would stay. He kissed her. Not the way she had imagined it in the dark during all those nights lying beside him. Not gentle, not tentative. His hands came up and framed her face with a desperation that trembled through his fingers, and his mouth found hers like a man's surfacing from deep water and taking his first breath. She responded with everything she had, her hands in his hair, her body pressing forward, the bond between them flaring with a heat that was almost blinding, and the sound he made against her mouth was so raw, so starved, it sent a shiver straight through her. If we do this, he said, pulling back just far enough to speak, his breath ragged against her lips. The bond completes. There is no going back. I know. It means everything. My wolf, my throne, my war. All of it becomes yours too. I know, she said, again, and you become mine. He watched her face. She watched the last wall fall. Not slowly, not in pieces. All at once, like a structure that had been standing only through stubbornness, and had finally been given permission to let go, he pulled her into him, and what followed was overwhelming and inevitable and exactly right. He was gentle and fierce in equal measure, tender where she needed tenderness, and unrestrained where she answered his intensity with her own. The world narrowed to warmth and closeness and the golden singing thread of the bond pulling tight between them. When the mating bite came, it was instinct. His teeth against her throat claiming, and the bond snapped into place, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known she carried. She felt it settle, warm and vast and permanent, weaving through every part of her. She bit him back. Her teeth against his shoulder, her mark on his skin, and the sound that tore from him was not pain, but completion. The bond blazed between them, finished and whole. His wolf, the great savage beast that had been tearing him apart from the inside, went quiet, not dormant, not defeated, quiet, like something that had finally, after a year of howling, been heard. They lay tangled together afterward, his arms around her, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow into something steady and calm. The tremor was gone, not lessened. Gone. I can feel you, he murmured against her hair. Through the bond. I can feel everything. Everything? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. He pressed his lips to her temple. You are extraordinary, he said. You have always been extraordinary. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. Aloan closed her eyes and let the bond hum between them, warm and golden and alive. For the first time in her life she felt whole, not fixed, not repaired. Whole in a way that had nothing to do with what she lacked, and everything to do with what she had chosen. She fell asleep in his arms. And deep inside her, beneath the bond and the warmth and the steady rhythm of his heart, the thing that had never been a wolf opened its eyes. She woke in the dead forest, the bone-gray sky pressed down. The cracked earth crunched beneath her bare feet. The white trees reached overhead like skeletal hands clawing at nothing. But this time it was different. This time she had chosen to be here. The bond hummed warmly, a tether connecting her to Theron, and she followed it forward through the trees without hesitation. She found him in the clearing. He was standing this time, not kneeling, and that small difference sent a wave of relief through her, so powerful. She nearly stumbled. The wolf was there too, massive, silver-black. Its amber eyes burned in the colorless landscape like twin embers, but it was not circling, not lunging. It sat 10 feet from Theron, watching him with an expression that was not aggression, but something far more painful. The wolf was grieving. Aloan felt it through the bond, a sorrow so deep and ancient it made her bones ache. She understood then what Brindis had said. The wolf hadn't been trying to consume Theron, it had been trying to reach him. Howling, thrashing, throwing itself against the walls of his control, not to destroy the man, but because the man had locked it away after Pale's death, and it had been alone in here ever since, alone with the memory of what it had done, alone with its own guilt. "Theron," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. He didn't look at her, but his hand found hers. "He is here," Theron said, his voice hollow. "He is always here." Lowen followed his gaze and saw what she had missed. A figure standing behind the wolf, half-transparent, flickering in the gray light. Young, tall, but not as tall as Theron. The same dark hair, the same jaw, but softer, kinder. A face built for smiling that was not smiling. Now, Kale, the ghost's eyes were fixed on Theron. Not with accusation, Eloan realized, with sorrow, with the same desperate, unreachable grief the wolf carried. 3 wounded things trapped in the same cage, each one unable to reach the others. "He wasn't angry," Eloan whispered, the realization settling over her. "He was never angry with you." "He should be," Theron said. "I should have been stronger, faster. I should have held the wolf back." "You couldn't have," Eloan said, "and somewhere inside you, you know that. But you've been punishing yourself anyway. And your wolf has been punishing itself, and neither of you has stopped long enough to see that you are doing the same thing." She turned to face him. "You locked the wolf away, Theron. After Kale died, you built a wall between yourself and your own beast, because you couldn't bear to feel what it felt. But it felt the same thing you did. It loved Kale too. And it has been in here, alone, grieving, with no one to tell it that what happened was not what it wanted. That it didn't choose to kill your brother any more than you did." Theron's face crumbled. The composure he had maintained even here, even in this terrible place, shattered. "I can't forgive it," he whispered. "It took him from me." "It is you," Eloan said, and her voice broke on the words. "The wolf is you. It has always been you. You are not 2 halves fighting for control. You are one person, fractured by grief, tearing yourself apart, because you don't know how to mourn without blame." She looked at the wolf. Its amber eyes met hers, and she saw the desperation in them, the longing. Not to dominate, to be forgiven, to be let back in, to stop being alone. Eloan thought of her room at Thornhaven, the locked door. The word broken, said so many times it had calcified into something she believed about herself, down to the marrow. She thought of the day Brindis had told her that her family declared her dead, the ceremony, her father's manufactured tears. How she had been erased, not because she was dangerous or defective, but because she was inconvenient, because her existence complicated a family that preferred clean, simple narratives. She looked at Theron, and at his wolf, and at the ghost of the brother they had both loved. "I spent 19 years believing I was nothing," she said. And the words came from somewhere deeper than thought. That I was broken because I didn't have a wolf. That I deserved to be hidden because something was missing in me. And the worst part wasn't that my family said it. The worst part was that I agreed. I stayed in my room, and I stayed quiet, and I stayed small, because I thought that was all I was allowed to be." She felt tears on her face. "But I was wrong, and you are wrong too. Not about the grief. The grief is real, and it should be. Kale deserved to live, and you deserved a brother, and your wolf deserved a pack that was whole. But the punishment, the wall, the war inside yourself, that has to stop. Because it is not honoring him, it is destroying you." The wolf whimpered, a sound so raw and small from something so enormous that it split her heart open. She released Theron's hand and walked toward the beast. It could have crushed her with a single snap of its jaws. It was vast, its shoulder higher than her head, its amber eyes blazing. She reached up and placed both hands against the side of its massive skull. "You are not a monster," she told it. "You never were." The wolf shuddered, its eyes closed. Aloan looked back at Theron. "Forgive yourself," she said. "Forgive your wolf, not because the pain doesn't matter, but because you are allowed to survive it." Theron moved. Slowly, like a man walking through deep water, he crossed the clearing and stood before the wolf. His wolf. The beast that had shared his soul since he was a boy and had broken beside him on the worst night of his life. He placed his hand on the wolf's neck, beside Aloan's. "I'm sorry," he said to the wolf. "I left you alone. I blamed you because I couldn't bear to blame myself, and I locked you in here, and I let you carry this without me." The wolf pressed into his hand. The ghost of Kale flickered. Then the young man's face softened. The sorrow didn't leave, but something else joined it, something that looked, impossibly, like peace. Kyle's ghost looked at his brother one last time. Then he closed his eyes and dissolved into the gray air, like morning fog meeting sunlight. The dead forest shivered. The bone-gray sky cracked, and for the first time, light, real, golden, warm light, poured through the fractures and touched the ground. The white trees trembled, and where the light touched them, color seeped back. Bark darkening to brown. Leaves unfurling, life returning. The wolf raised its head and howled. Not in pain, not in rage, in release. The sound carried through the changing landscape, shaking loose the last remnants of the gray, and Theron stood with tears streaming down his face, his hand on his wolf's neck, and let the sound wash through him. Aloan reached for his other hand and held it tightly. She opened her eyes in his bed, in his arms, in the warm amber glow of the fire. Theron was already awake, looking down at her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. His eyes were clear, his face was calm. And deep inside their bond, where the wolf lived, there was silence. Not absence, not the strained, desperate quiet of a beast held back by force. Peace. The wolf and the man, resting together for the first time in over a year. "It's over," he said, and his voice cracked with disbelief. Aloan smiled through her tears. She pressed her forehead against his and felt the bond pulse between them. "It's over," she agreed. The healing was not instant. Aloan had never expected it to be. Grief did not obey commands, and forgiveness was not a single act, but a practice. Something chosen again each morning upon waking. Theron still dreamed of Scale, but the dreams were no longer battlefields, they were memories. His brothers laugh at the breakfast table. The afternoon, they had raced their wolves through the highland meadows, and Kale had won by cheating so blatantly that even the horses noticed. The night before the challenge, when Sheil had stood in the doorway of Theron's study and said, "You know I don't want this," and Theron had said, "I know," and neither of them had been brave enough to find another way. He woke from those dreams with wet eyes and steady hands, and Aloan held him in the dark until the sadness passed through him like weather. The wolf settled. Not overnight, but over weeks, the balance between man and beast rebuilt itself, stronger now for having been broken and repaired. The involuntary shift stopped. The tremor disappeared entirely. Theron laughed more than she had ever heard him laugh, a low, surprised sound, as though joy was a language he was relearning from scratch. Eloan's own body changed in ways she did not fully understand. The warmth inside her that had once felt like a phantom stirring grew clearer. Brindis monitored it with fascination, running tests, consulting old texts. "You are not wolfless," the healer told her one morning, with the satisfied expression of someone whose suspicions had been magnificently confirmed. "You never were." Aloan gaped at her. "Then what am I?" "Something older, rarer. The texts call it a soul mender, a wolf that manifests, not as a beast, but as a bridge. Your wolf doesn't shift. It reaches. It enters other wolves and heals what is broken inside them. She paused. Your family saw the absence of a shift and called you broken. They were looking at a river and calling it empty because it didn't behave like a stone. The court's reaction to their mating was exactly as terrible as Eloan had anticipated. Whispers followed her through every corridor. The dead Voss daughter, the wolfless foundling, the nobody who had somehow claimed the Alpha King. She felt the judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders with every public appearance, every formal dinner, every introduction that required her to stand beside Theron and pretend the staring didn't cut. Lord Aldrich Voss attempted to claim credit. He arrived at court 6 weeks after the mating announcement, with a revised family history that conveniently omitted the locked room, the false mourning ceremony, and 19 years of erasure. He presented himself as a devoted father who had merely been protecting a fragile daughter and wept, publicly, when he spoke of his joy at her union with the king. Theron listened to the performance without expression. When Aldrich finished, the king leaned forward in his throne and said, very calmly, "Lord Voss, you told my court your daughter was dead. You held a mourning ceremony for a girl who is alive and locked in your east wing. You lied to the crown and you lied to your child, and you did it because her existence embarrassed you." The hall went silent. "The Voss family will forfeit its seat on the provincial council," Theron continued. "Your lands will be administered by a crown appointee until further notice, and you will leave this court today and not return until I decide you have earned the right to stand in the same room as your daughter." Aldrich's face went white. He opened his mouth, found nothing to say, and was escorted from the hall by 2 guards who did not look remotely sympathetic. Eloan watched her father leave and waited for the satisfaction to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was a quiet sadness, the grief of a girl who had wanted a father and gotten a warden, and the slower, harder knowledge that no amount of royal justice would give her back the years she had lost. Theron's hand found hers on the armrest of her chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She squeezed his fingers and let the sadness move through her and out the other side. Months later, Eloan woke to morning light streaming through the curtains of the king's chamber. Their chamber, the room smelled of cedar, and the lingering sweetness of the honeysuckle that climbed the window frame outside. Beside her, Theron slept. His face was peaceful. His breathing was deep and even, the breathing of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of closing his eyes. One arm was draped across her waist, heavy and warm. His hand rested against her stomach, fingers spread wide, and even in sleep his grip was sure. Eloan watched him for a long moment. The morning light traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the faint scar along his collarbone that she had kissed so many times she had lost count. Through the bond, she could feel his wolf, calm, content, present. Not a prisoner, not a threat, a companion, the other half of the man she loved, resting beside the other half of her. She settled back against his chest and closed her eyes. The word broken drifted through her mind one last time, distant and powerless, a sound from another life that no longer meant anything at all. She let it go. And in the warm silence of their room, with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and the bond humming golden between them, they slept.